Hello YouTube, this is Marvin. I want to share some information with you regarding the diminished seventh chord. The diminished seventh chord. Now, there are three things that I want to discuss with the diminished seventh chord. The first one is that the diminished seventh chord is made up entirely of whole steps and half steps. Whole steps and half steps. Now you may say that the major scale is also made up of whole steps and half steps. The difference is the diminished scale is made up alternately between whole steps and half steps. Where in the major scale, let's say from C to D is a whole step, from D to E is also a whole step. But with a diminished scale, after a whole step always comes a half step. From C to D, whole step, D to E, half step, E to F, whole step, F to G flat, half step, G flat to A, whole step, half step, whole step, and you end back with C again. The same if you start on D. Sound. If you can get that pattern in your ears, you don't have to think about the half steps. If you just know the sound. Okay. The second thing about the diminished scale is that we have two different types of diminished scales. They're the same notes, but since it's a symmetrical scale, meaning that it has even parts, it's always made up of whole steps and half steps from the root position or from half steps to whole steps. I just showed you the diminished scale using a root note and then a whole step from the root note. Now let's do a diminished scale starting with a root note and go a half step, which would be D. Then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. Okay, and the reason that we have two different diminished scales is because that diminished scale can complement, or you can play that diminished scale over two different types of seventh chords, seventh and ninth chords. And we'll get into that a little later on. Third thing is that a major scale has 7 different notes. A diminished scale has 8 different notes. To D flat. Diminished scale has 8 different notes. Okay, how do we use that diminished scale? A diminished scale is used over a diminished chord. And let's differentiate between the scale and the chord. The scale has 8 different notes. The chord, diminished seventh chord, has 4 notes, and each note is a minor third apart. Starting on D, third from D would be E, third from E would be G, third from G would be B flat. Okay? And that is how your diminished chord sounds. And a diminished chord, seventh chord, has 3 different inversions. This is root position. To get to your first inversion, you take the bottom note, put it on top, retain these 3 notes, and you have first inversion. Second inversion, you take the bottom note, put it on top, retain these 3, and you have second inversion. Third inversion, take the bottom note, put it on top, retain these three, and you have third inversion, and then back to root position. Okay? Now let's use that diminished chord in a progression, in a chord progression. Let's say we're in the key of C major. We have the 1 chord. We want to go to D minor, which is the 2 chord. That sounds okay. To your 2 chord. Now we want a little more movement. Listen to this. You hear that a lot in gospel music. That second chord is a diminished 7th chord. Nothing more than a diminished 7th chord. And that diminished 7th chord is placed between the 2 chords. We have the 1 chord going to the 2 chord, where the diminished goes up a half step and is played in between the 1 chord and the 2 chord. Once again, go up a half step and make it diminish. Okay? So when you hear that, you can recognize it as being, that second chord as being a diminished chord. Okay, now what else can we do with that progression? We can put the diminished scale in there over the diminished chord, like this. Hear that? I put all 8 notes in there. You don't have to always use the 8 notes, you can just pick some. Any note that you choose, any notes you choose. Okay? Now that's one way of using the diminished scale. Another way would be to use the diminished scale over a dominant 7th chord with a flatted 9. A dominant 7th chord with a flatted 9, and my voicing would be the 5th, the flatted 7, the flatted 9, and the 3. Now with this particular chord, you have to use a whole step. Well, basically it's really, you start with the root, and instead of a whole step, use a half step and then a whole step. On the root, the chord is G. The scale would be root, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, and back to the whole step, G. To play that over G, dominant with the flatted 9, I played all 8 notes and it works. And that's the second way of using a diminished 7th chord. If we put all that together, we start with the 1, diminished, 2 minor, 5 flatted 9, back to 1. And the last thing, with the dominant 7 flatted 9, if you are familiar with your extensions and your altered extensions, you can name those notes, and that way you will not have to think about the whole steps and half step. Starting with the root G, flatted 9, raised ninth, B flat, third, B, raised fourth, D flat, the fifth, which is D, the sixth, E, flatted seventh, F, and back to root again. And we know that the flatted ninth is the same as the flatted second. The sharp ninth is the same as the minor third, and so on. So I hope this helped you a lot. And if you will, just make some comments and let me know what you think and if you can use this information. And I will give more information concerning music at a later time.